Hello, I'm Jyotsna Singh, and I'm delighted to be here to discuss the Mughals in the European imaginary. And what I'm going to do is take you through a kind of a visual journey with some text through a PowerPoint, and we will talk through it, and then we'll have lots of images and paintings. And then when we meet in August, hopefully we can also have more live questions. So I'm going to start with the PowerPoint and through the screen share, and we will just I will just walk you through this, and we can then go from there. And this journey will be to India under the Mughal Empire. For this talk, we will cover the years 1550 to 1690. So this is really over two emperors, and really the focus of my talk will be on the Emperor Jahangir. We will have a short discussion of Akbar's reign, who was Jahangir's father. The Mughal Empire was founded by Babur, who came from Central Asia and Kabul, which is now Afghanistan. And its first 6 rulers left a lingering and transformative impact on the early modern world, and even today, an enduring legacy. These 5 rulers were Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. And collectively, their reign ran from 1526 to 1707. So Babur was the founder. This dynasty was called the Timurids, as Babur was the direct descendant of the Emperor Timur, who, as you all know, figures as Tamburlaine in the play by Christopher Marlowe. So it's always fun to teach Tamburlaine in your high school or in college, and then talk about the real Tamburlaine, who is a very, very famous and renowned figure. And the Mughals were very happy to be called the Timurids. Isn't this moving?
Use the lower left-hand corner of the screen to advance.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. And so between 1453 and 1526, Muslims founded 3 major states in the Mediterranean, Iran, and South Asia. They were called the Ottomans, who were in Turkey, the Safavids, who were in Persia, and the Mughal Empire, which was in India. By the early 17th century, their descendants controlled territories from the Balkans, North Africa, to Bengal, which is East India. They comprised an imperial cultural zone within the broader cultural Islamic civilization. And Muslims and other inhabitants in these contiguous empires jointly inherited political, religious, literary, and artistic values and ideas, and their shared inheritance was reinforced through the circulation of individuals, merchants, military men, mariners, religious travelers, artists, ambassadors, among others. So I give a long list here of people who will be visiting these empires to show that these were very cosmopolitan empires. They were huge, and they were vast, and they were cosmopolitan. The reason I'm interested in these empires, because often when we study the European Renaissance in the West, in the US or in Britain, we always imagine the Renaissance simply taking place in Italy and then in Europe and in England. We do not think of a kind of huge Renaissance and enormous power that was in these Muslim Islamic empires. And the focus, is also on the Christian empires, whether it was Catholics or Protestants. So I think my research and my interest has started with what else was the Renaissance. And the work that I'm doing now is it's very kind of current, and we call it the global Renaissance. So my approach to my work is shaped by kind of 2 pedagogical questions or 2 pedagogical topics. Overall, my approach is shaped by this new historical subfield called encounter studies. It's not, it's not as established, say, as post-colonial studies, but among historians and people interested in travel narratives, in cross-cultural encounters, it's a very important line of inquiry. This was influenced by the work of Sanjay Subramaniam, and I'm going to just read a quote here from him. And he says the historiography of the early modern period seems to have had an abiding fascination with the moment of face-to-face encounter between the Europeans and his other. And its attendant mise-en-scène, the topos itself remains dominant. Yet much is obviously lost here, for each of these alleged encounters, in fact, represented a chronology and a series of events rather than a simple moment. The history of events should not be neglected in the larger history of mentalities. The structural tensions and forms of perception can only be read out in the fine grain of events. So there are two things here. One is that if you look at the early modern period through the encounter motif, you find it's repeated again and again and again. And often it's between Europeans and their others. But he is stressing that you cannot look at it as an individual moment, but you also have to look at it in a larger global sense. And the terms that he uses in one of his texts, which I'll talk about later, called 3 Ways of Being Alien, is he looks at what he calls microhistories and global contexts. And so I always like to keep that in mind when I'm teaching, that they can be microhistories of individuals like these emperors, but then they're also the larger global context. And we have to see it as a tension, not as a kind of static dynamic. The other issue that I'm framing my talk today is, and also an issue I use a lot in my classrooms, is the question, what is an archive? How does what collect information about a period, a culture, or person? Does it always have the processes of inclusion and exclusion? And there's another author, I think, who is an ethnographer, who has written about this subject, called Anne Stoller. And in this quote, she shows us how power relations are linked to this archival process. Scholars should view archives, she says, not as sites of knowledge retrieval, but of knowledge production, as monuments of state as well as sites of state ethnography. This requires a sustained engagement with archives as cultural agents of fact production and of state authority. We should look to archives as epistemological experiments rather than as sources, to colonial archives as cross-sections of contested knowledge. More importantly, she suggests to recognize dominant archives as both transparencies on which power relations were inscribed and intricate technologies of rules in themselves. So I think the key things we can get is that archives are agents of fact production, that the material information is not simply there that we get, but we produce information by our modes of retrieval. And they're also actually agents of authority, how we know something and how we present it as knowledge. So she uses the term contested knowledge. So in a way, what we are doing in my talk today is a contested knowledge. We are looking at knowledge of the Mughals through the Europeans, and towards the end of my talk, we'll be looking at how the Mughals represented themselves and how actually they were very little interested in Europe in their representations and their own self-representations. So in the structure of the talk, I'm just going to go over these 4 travelers, English travelers, who visited India in the reign of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And you will get a bibliography, but you can find all these accounts in a travel collection compiled by Samuel Purkis. And this collection is called Haeclutus Posthumus, or Purkis's Pilgrims in 1625. It is a 5-volume collection, and many of the Indian accounts are in volume 1. And you can find this on Ebo, Early English Books Online. Many libraries have it. You can also get it online if you browse. There are a lot of open text digital sources. All the voyages of the East India Company from 1600 onwards are recorded by Purkis, though some are scattered in other volumes. And I'll talk a little bit about Purkis in a moment. And next, I will briefly examine the writings of a Portuguese Jesuit missionary, Father Montserrat. He's our traveler 5, who was an important early European eyewitness to the Mughal court of Akbar, who was the father of Jahangir and actually one of the most important emperors India has ever had. The Portuguese had a very, very important and an interesting role in India. They actually governed a very relatively smaller territory around Goa, which is on western coast, which is near Mumbai. but they controlled the sea, and they were seafarers. And they also were really responsible for the spread of Christianity in India. The Jesuits were linguists, they knew many languages, they were scholars, and they were a kind of thorn on the English side. They had a lot of influence. And finally, I want to look at some of the native Mughal perspectives in one memoir called Humayun Nama by Princess Gulbadan, who was the daughter of Babur. And then the rest of the presentation, I really want to talk about Mughal paintings. That's perspective 6. Mughal paintings are really a very important cultural source of understanding the Mughal Empire. And I will mention a bit later how all the historical manuscripts, all the history books, so to speak, were illustrated. They had huge court artists. And this was not only true of the Mughal Empire, but this was true of the other 2 Muslim empires. This was true of the Safavids in Persia and the Ottomans in Turkey. And they had shared artists. The artists would move from Persia and Turkey to India and so forth. The second thing very broadly you should know, while these 3 empires were Muslim, they were different Shia Sunni. The Safavids were Shias. But there was a kind of upper class Persianate refined culture. And so while Turkish was also a language spoken, through these empires, but the formal court cultures of all the 3 empires were very influenced by the Persian language and a kind of Persian cultural production. So let's start with Traveller 1, who I've been working on recently. His name was Captain William Hawkins, and his book was called, his narrative was called Relations of the Occurrence which Happened in the Time of His Residence in India in the Country of the Great Mughal. And he was in Jahangir's court from 1608, 1611. And he left a detailed account, which you can find in Samuel Purkis's volume that I've just mentioned, but we do not have an image of him. Thomas Roe was also in Jahangir's court from 1616, 1690. He came after William Hawkins. He was the formal ambassador sent by King James I and also representing the East India Company in the court of Jahangir. William Hawkins styled himself as ambassador, but wasn't really formally appointed. Roe arrived at the port of Surat, as did Captain Hawkins, in September of 1615 with a letter from King James to the then reigning Mughal Emperor Jahangir, seeking a trade agreement. The ambassador would go on to spend 4 years of negotiations at the Mughal court, eventually returning to England in 1690 without a very firm trade agreement. He did have a kind of agreement, but it didn't have too much complete bearing. Also interestingly, Thomas Roe then after India goes on to become the English ambassador in the Ottoman court in Istanbul. So let's start with William Hawkins. And he was sent as Lieutenant General in this voyage under the command of Captain Keelings. So these were the East India Company voyages, and Hawkins was the captain of the Hector. You will all receive this PowerPoint, and here you can have a URL where you can get more of the historical background. So through the PowerPoint, there'll be a couple of sites like this. Little is known of William Hawkins' early career, except that he'd been in the Levant and West Indies and was conversant in Turkish. That he had the Turkish tongue, he tells us himself when describing his discussions with Jahangir. When in 1614, the company was pressured by the Lord Privy Seal to appoint one Captain Harris to be chief commander, Sir Thomas Smythe responded with the argument that a general had need of multiple skills. He should be a navigator, partly a merchant to lead a ship, and partly a man of fashion and good respect. And Hawkins probably fulfilled these qualities. He was chosen to manage diplomatic negotiations in regard of his experience and language. When he stepped ashore, he declared, "In the best manner I could befitting for the honor of my king and country, whose ambassador he rather grandiloquently claimed to be." Hawkins was not a formal ambassador like Thomas Roe, but he did carry a letter from the king. And though boilerplate letters by English monarchs like Elizabeth and James were often carried by East India Company representatives. So I think this is something we should keep in mind, that there was a kind of genre of the king's letter. So any voyage that went, they could have letters from Elizabeth or James, but didn't mean that they were, specifically emissaries and ambassadors. Now, this is a very important one of the Mughal paintings, and I'll show you many. And this is a Mughal painting which was done much later. This was done in the reign of Shah Jahan, which was between 1628, 1658. And so many of these paintings are kind of retrospective. They paint scenes and events that occurred kind of before their time. And it's from a book called the Padshah Name, which is the Book of Emperors. Now, this is a very important scene of the court as to who's seated where. They were always seated on this darbar or a balcony type throne from where you could have a viewing. And it would be in such a place where he would have received William Hawkins. So at the center of the scene is Jahangir, the emperor. And then he is meeting his son, Prince Khurram, who later became Shah Jahan. You also look at the faces below, and you see throughout, there's quite a lot of ethnic diversity. Some of them are sort of Central Asian, they have slightly East Asian features. So they were the Mongolians, or they were the, what today we call the Uzbeks. And then some of them could also be Hindus, who were the original inhabitants. And, there was a large Hindu population ruled by the Mughals. And they are often of darker complexion, and often they don't have beards. So you can see a variety of ethnic types. And the emperor had enormous power, and they were very invested in ceremonial rituals and ceremonial, displays of power. And English travelers had a real problem unless they knew the language. Because everybody, as I said, the upper class courts in the Mughal world and in the Islamic world, the Safavids and the Ottomans, they all would know some Persian, which was the formal language, and they would know some Turkish. But Thomas Roe, who didn't know the languages, had an issue, whereas William Hawkins, knew Turkish. So on the right-hand side, you have the port of Surat, which is a big port, which is on the west coast of India on what is called the Arabian Sea. And this is a picture of later on, but you could see this is a picture of the Dutch. And this is where Hawkins arrived, and this is where Roe arrived. And then from here, they would have to make quite a long journey to Agra or Fatehpur Sikri, which is sort of up, in the center of India up north. On the left-hand side is Sir Thomas Smythe, the first governor of the East India Company. And the East India Company had enormous power. And they are the ones who gradually set up the trading privileges and trading rights. And it was only in 1857 that the company was abolished and there was direct English rule. So I think this is something to imagine. And all these voyages were sponsored by the company. And we can, we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along. So the traveler number 2 was Sir Thomas Roe. But before I talk of Roe, I think a little bit more on Hawkins and language. Hawkins, as I said, spoke Turkish. So he was welcomed by Jahangir. Jahangir gave him a title. He called him Khan, which is like Lord. He gave him money, and you have privileges of certain hundreds of horses. And he also, very interestingly, arranged a marriage of William Hawkins to a woman called Maryam Khan, who was an Armenian. There are no pictures of those, so I can't show you. So Hawkins had some success in personal relations, and Jahangir did not want him to leave. He kept asking him to stay. But in the end, he couldn't get many trading privileges, and the Portuguese had a lot of power. And there's also sort of apocryphal stories from other travels that he was a drunk, that he would go be drunk and go to the court. And then finally he left. But his account is really amazing. And, we can talk more about that later. So this is a painting of Thomas Roe made much later by an English painter in the 19th century who wanted to imagine that the English had great presence and they were very warmly welcomed in the court. But, there is no Mughal painting. And I think, remember this, there is no Mughal painting that depicts Thomas Roe, William Hawkins, or any English travelers. There are some Mughal paintings that depict the Jesuits, and I can show you that. So the fascination with the Mughals, both in writings, in memoirs, was not really reciprocated by the Mughals. The Mughals' biographies didn't mention the English, which is, I think, a really interesting account that many people think about. So on the right-hand side, you have a more formal portrait of Thomas Roe. And on the left-hand side is another Mughal painting that I think is very interesting to see. And this is, they would often have these paintings which were called dynastic paintings. So this is an imaginary painting where in the center of it you have Timur, you have Tamerlane, and on the left you have Babur, who was the descendant, and on the right you have Humayun, and the other three men are sort of aristocrats. So you have many paintings like this where the dates are collapsed, and you have paintings of fathers and sons, of grandfathers, of ancestors. So I think that's just an important way to see the Mughal culture. So I'm just going to give you a brief summary, because Thomas Roe was actually the most important. He received a royal charter, sorry, the East India Company received the royal charter to trade with India from the British monarch Elizabeth I in 1600. And their envoy, one of their envoys was William Hawkins, who had visited Jahangir in 1608. However, this visit did not bear fruits as he could not secure a permit to establish a factory at Surat. So the word factory at the time didn't mean factory in terms of manufacturing, but it meant like a trading station. And the people who worked in these trading stations were called factors. The Portuguese were having successful trade relations with India at the time, and they influenced the Mughal court against the British. As I said, the Portuguese ruled the western coast near Surat in this place called Goa. And they had a lot of influence. They had power over the sea, and they were also doing trade. So the English decided to send Sir Thomas Roe to achieve what Hawkins could not. He was an able statesman who took care not to repeat Hawkins' mistakes. He brought many rare gifts from Europe to present to the Mughal ruler. He took great care to present himself with dignity and authority befitting an ambassador of the mighty English king. However, his stay in the court, as he recounts in his journals and letters to the East India Companies, was filled with struggles to please Jahangir. And there are many accounts of he would bring gifts and the emperor would not like the gifts. And he kept asking the company to send him money, to send him gifts. Jahangir, I think, liked horses, he liked dogs, he liked carriages, but he was very fickle because the English did not have the kind of wealth and jewels to give him. His account of his stay in India was called the Journal of the Mission to the Mughal Empire. And this is a valuable document shedding light on the history of the early 17th century in India. Jahangir does not mention Roe in his memoir, as I mentioned, and his memoir was called Tuzke Jahangiri's Institute of Jahangir. Roe did gain some trading rights in a farman, like an edict, though rivals undermined it. Yet I think it's important to remember, although he obtained sort of tenuous trading rights for the British, this was the first step in the beginning of the British control of the Indian subcontinent. So if you think of the British Empire lasting a few hundred years, Roe's position was very clear. Now we move on to traveler number 3, who was Edward Terry. He was a chaplain. And all of these East India Company voyages would send Anglican ministers because they had to take care of the souls as much as the material wealth and material well-being. And I think here, this is a sort of piece I had written earlier about, you look at 2 Anglican ministers. One was Edward Terry and one was Samuel Purkis. Remember, he was the compiler of the anthology of all the travel narratives in which these writings you can find. Terry was a chaplain for Sir Thomas Roe, ambassador to the Mughal court of Emperor Jahangir, and emissary to the East India Company. His journal was called A Voyage to East India. It was published in 1625 in Purkis and later in 1655 and 65. And it contains a very important discussion of Indian religions and differences between Hindus and Mohammedans. Terry's journal was published by Samuel Purkis in his anthology, Purkis's Pilgrimage, that I mentioned. And I think Purkis was very interested in Islam. And in one of his volumes, he also wrote a lot about Muhammad and the Quran. And in fact, Purkis was the first person to have the Quran translated in English. And you can find that both these men, who were Christians, who were Anglicans, on one hand, they rejected Islam, viewing it as irreligion, and religion as synonymous to Christianity, but they were also interpreted the culture with some complexity and ambiguity, producing new ethnographic knowledge about Muslims and Islam. They were very fascinated, they were intrigued. And this is his voyage to East India. And I'm not going to read everything, but on the side, on the right-hand side, you can find how Muhammad was, stereotypically depicted. He was shown as somebody who was from very low parentage, and he was shown as a deceiver, a man filled with subtlety and craft. And they believed this religion was based on ignorance, it was based on impieties, and that he was an imposture. He was not honest, and he should not be trusted. And you can have him, you can see here Terry in this, and it's, his travels were very celebrated. And I think, as I'm just going to quickly repeat this, both of Terry and Purkis looked at Islam via Protestant Christianity. But at the same time, these intentions are further inflected by the ethnographic impulses of categorizing knowledge. And in the end, it seems like these interactions illuminate Christian identity formations perhaps more than they reveal about Islam. In both instances, combined with polemical discrediting of Muhammad, Muhammad, chief murderer, thief, impostor, and his Al-Quran, you also find explicit Muslim voices and presences emerge as specters to produce a thick description of Muslim worlds. So I think this is really important. We learn a lot about the Muslim world through these people. According to one of the theorists, Timothy Fitzgerald, he wants us to ask the question, and this is a question you can ask your student: what did religion mean to Anglicans or broadly Protestants when they encountered other religions, specifically Islam, in travel accounts or in actual witnesses of native religions in non-European nations? And what Fitzgerald is saying, that religion itself is a contested category. There are different archives of religious knowledge. And so we should look at religion in a very dynamic sense. Is how did these Anglicans address religion when they met people who were not Christians? So here there's a long quote by Terry that he also finds many good things in Islam, even while he's criticizing them. And here he says, it cannot be denied, but there are some good things in the precepts which Muhammad prescribed to be received and observed by his followers. And then he lists down these 8 commandments: that God is great and only God, children must obey their parents, everyone must do to another that which he would have done to him, every man must pray 5 times, and the whole moon in every year, every man come to year's discretion must find time for fasting. This is the Ramadan. And everyone must give to the poor, and they must marry to increase and multiply the sect. So these were commandments not too far removed from the Christian commandments. He does then backtrack and says, of course, these commandments are good because the devil himself sometime had a scripture in his mouth. So he is trying to win over the heretics. But it's very important. Second, I think Terry does and others do, he praises Jahangir's Mughal empires for being a very tolerant place of universal acceptance. And he says in that empire, all religions are tolerated, which make the tyrannical government there much more easy to be endured. The Jahangir would speak well of all of them, saying that a man might be happy and safe in the profession of any religion, and therefore would say that the Mohammedan religion was good, so was the Christian religion good, and the rest good. And therefore, by the way, the priests of ministers or religions find regard and esteem among the people, no matter what religion they belong to. The traveler number 4, and I'm not going to go too much, and you should look him up, who's a very interesting character. He was like an accidental tourist. He walked to India, and before he walked to India, he had written a book called Coryat's Crudities about his travels in Europe, which was very famous. And he came to India, he came overland, and there are 2 collections of his letters. One is this one, his friends to England send it greetings. And then the other one, which is here, which he sends later on, it's, the picture of him on an elephant. So these were just 2 of his writings. And here on this URL, you can find more details about his arrival. And I just read a little quote. And so he came by overland. So he also landed at Surat. And then he walks from there or comes from there by some carriage or something to a place called Mandu, which was also part of the empire, where he meets Roe. And so this is a description by a book by Charles Nichols. Thomas Coryat was a small bearded man with a long, rather lugubrious face. The shape of his head, according to one description, was like a sugar loaf and flirted with the end little before it. He wore simple native clothes and was thin to the point of emaciation. He had traveled down from the city of Agra 400 miles to the north, and it is fairly safe he had done so on foot. En route, he connected to an English party. The ambassador was Sir Thomas Roe, a tough, intelligent, rather prickly man, a kind of blueprint for future administrators of British India. And Roe had been in Mandu for 6 months, grappling with exhaustion and dysentery in attendance to the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, whose whimsical progress he was forced to follow. Coryat knew Roe from the English court, because Coryat had also sort of hung out in the court of Prince Henry. And throughout Roe's writings, he does mention Coryat, and he thinks he's a kind of crazy guy. And but he and Edward Terry, who I just mentioned, became great friends, and they also shared a house or something for a while. Coryat died in India on the way back. He died of, people think, drinking too much sherry, and so he's buried in Surat. His tomb is there. Our final traveler is Father Montserrat, who was a Portuguese. And here we are kind of going back a little bit in time during Akbar's reign. And the Jesuits, as I said, were very important. And you can, if you click on this URL, you'll find his full commentary. And a really exciting new translation of this commentary is being prepared by a friend of mine, João Vicente Melo, who teaches at Oxford. And he is going to almost finish it. He's translated it. He's doing the introduction. So there has been no translation of this since 1922. Now, the background of the Jesuits is very important, is that it's the Portuguese who first, quote unquote, discovered India. It was Vasco da Gama, who came on Cochin on India's eastern coast. And the Indian mission of the Jesuits lies at the very origin of the order. It is to India that Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus, sent his greatest son, Francis Xavier. And Francis Xavier's body is still interred in Goa. You know, he is still there. And to him and his collaborators that he gave that inspiration and those directives, which became the basis of the Jesuit mission and method. India has also been the birthplace of missionary theories and the testing ground of missionary policies. So the Jesuits were already there. But in 1570s, Akbar was very interested in knowing about other religions. Akbar was Jahangir's father. So in 1579, Akbar's ambassador arrived in Goa, which was the center of the Portuguese rule, with a letter asking for 2 learned priests to be sent to Akbar's court. 3 Jesuits arrived, Father Rudolph Aquaviva, Father Anthony Montserrat, and the Persian-born Father Francis Henrique as his companions. They reached Fatehpur Sikri, which is south of Delhi, and it's near Agra. It was a new city that Akbar built, and later on, for various reasons, he kind of left it. But they were received with extraordinary warmth and affection, whose attachment continued through the 3 years of the duration of this mission. So while this mission was there for 3 years, the Jesuits kept coming. And this is supposedly Montserrat. We are not sure, but this is the only image. And this is his commentary. And the link that I've given is you can read the whole commentary in English and you can share it with your students, and it's free. So I think the Portuguese influence, and I'll just kind of quickly go over this. The clear objective of the Jesuits was to convert the emperor. Through the 3 years of acquaintance, Akbar showed friendliness with them but remained uncommitted. Their uncompromising advocacy for the Christian faith, occasionally perceived by the audience as aggressive, was met by firm commitment of the Muslim scholars to Islam. The interest that Akbar showed in Christianity, giving rise to Jesuit hopes that they could be converted, turned out to be nothing more than a reflection of the religious eclecticism of the Emperor Akbar, who had hesitation in using Christian imagery as a propaganda tool. But Akbar was an eclectic and rationalist politic who was also a mystic, but he did not want to embrace Christianity. In fact, he announced a new kind of religion called Deen-e-Ilahi, religion of man, which dashed the Jesuit hopes. While they didn't succeed in converting Akbar, they provided an extremely important chapter in the history of interreligious dialogue in India and in our view of the Mughal court. Subsequent missionaries, Jesuits, were also well received by the Mughal court during Jahangir's time, when Rao was there. And they were rivals to to the English in Jahangir's reign. So we have a really interesting account of the Jesuit presence. And overall, I think Jesuits lived 8 or 10 years in the various Mughal courts, in Fatehpur and in Agra. They had their own churches, they had their own accommodations, and they all knew languages. So they spoke probably Farsi and Latin and Persian. This is a very, very famous painting. And here you have Akbar holding a religious assembly in what was called the Ibadat Khana. It's called the House of Worship, which you could still see in India when you go. And here you find the two men dressed in black are the Jesuit missionaries. It's not Montserrat, but Aquaviva and Henrique. Now, this painting was part of a book called Akbar Nama, which is a biography of Akbar's written by his counselor and friend Abul Fazl. And this was only came out as a painting in 1605. So this is after, much long after the incident and after, this scene. This is another scene. It's very similar to the one we saw of the Darbar, the court. And this is similar. This is Jahangir's court. And in this you can find right on this left-hand corner, a Jesuit. You can find a Jesuit and you can see Jahangir is presenting himself to his courtiers and envoys. And they're shown in a very formal arrangement. The closer you are to the throne, the more important you are. On the balcony, you have Jahangir's son and grandson. And then you have this layering of figures and a ceremonial elephant and horse. And I think what these paintings show, all these paintings of the court show, a world of really very high formal decorum and civility. And this was called Sule Kul, which loosely translated means universal civility. So what the Muslims, the Mughals, while they were brutal conquerors and they were very brutal in some of their punishments and their justice, they also had a court that was a very egalitarian, cosmopolitan in its diversity of peoples. And they also had these elaborate ceremonial rituals to emphasize civility, decorum, interactions, exchanges, and so forth. Finally, perspective 6 is a actually native perspective of Mughal India. And this is actually really brilliant. I have attached, which you will receive, an article that I wrote on it. And this is has got a lot of interest in recent years. And if you click on this URL, you can find the full text of this translation. So this is a very famous translation by a woman called Annette Beveridge. She and her husband both were great Orientalists. They were very, very fond of India. They knew the languages, and this translated. And this was found in the British Library. This was in the British Library. But the original manuscript, which was in Persian, was only discovered in the 19th century. We have no image of Gulbadan, but we have an image of what a Mughal princess would look like. This is a picture of a later princess, much later Princess Nadira, who was the daughter-in-law of Shah Jahan. And you can see the costume. And if you look at the costume, which is what we still wear in India, there's a kind of really unisex. So you have these tight pants, which are called churidars, certain kinds of pajamas that both men and women wear. And then you have a kind of long skirt. And the top half is little more Hindu, the shorter blouse. So, but this is a kind of formal picture. Now, Gulbadan is, and I'll quickly read it. So a battered copy of the manuscript is kept in the British Library. This manuscript was just found in mid-19th century, mid-1800s. And it was sold to the British Museum by his widow for some very cheap price in 1868. Its existence was little known until 1901 when Annette Beveridge translated it into English. So I think this is like an amazing find. And Humayun Nama means the history of her brother, her half-brother, who was the Emperor Humayun, who was the father of Akbar. But she wrote this much later. She lived to a long life, and she wrote it at the request of her nephew, the Emperor Akbar. She writes about actually the conquest of India by her father, Babur. She writes about Humayun's household, about the fratricidal struggles between him and her half-brother. And she also kind of talks of customs, social customs, and really gives us a very good view of the life of women. And during the time when she was young, they didn't have any harem. It was a very peripatetic harem because they moved from Kabul to India after the conquest. But she writes of accounts where the men in the family, her father and others, would come to visit the women. So this is the only account written by a woman of life inside the sort of women's quarters or domestic arrangements. Now the last part, and I'll bring some of the themes that I've touched on before, is Mughal visual culture, paintings, manuscripts, calligraphy. And I think it's only in recent years that people have started looking at the representational practices of Mughal rulers, which were premised on the interconnection between textual and visual modes of history. So the paintings are as important historical sources as were the actual texts. And they believe veracity did not rest only in words, but also in visual images. Akbar, for instance, led the way in commissioning the writing of history, different kinds of histories, world histories, histories of his own dynasty, translations of his grandfather's memoirs, accounts of his father's reign and his own life. These were produced as richly illustrated manuscripts, many of them which are lying in the British Library or in the V&A or in various libraries. In the British Library, they don't let you see it or even touch it anymore. It's so precious. And in these histories, the textual concern for accuracy and precise observation found its visual counterpart thanks to the naturalism that had been possible through the lessons learned from European art. So one thing you must know about Mughal painting, it was very much influenced by European painting. And European painting was also influenced by the Islamic painting, including Rembrandt and others. So these paintings, to me, and I think it's something you can use in your classes, which I use in my classes, they are very, very richly detailed. And so they can give really precise observations. And then what we see here is a potential of interactions in terms of this visual material culture. And you have, and I'll talk a little bit about of the biographies, but we saw some of the earlier paintings and we can, so this is the same painting we've just seen. This is the Darbar, little close up. And if you look at the minute detail, the turban style, you can know where these people are from. Are they from Central Asia? Are they from Persia? Turban styles are very distinctive, if you know something of the East. You can see by the skin coloring, some are dark, some are lighter skin. You can see by the features, some are more East Asian, Mongolian, and here you can see the Jesuit, you can see the elephant, and I think here there's a horse. You see the canopies and the decorations. So these are great sources. And while Akbar is crediting for establishing Mughal miniature art in India, it was his father who brought these painters from Persia. He had been exiled during some battles. These painters found an academy of over 100 painters and artists from various parts of India. The Persian influence is apparent in the medium itself and the fine lines of the script. Often you would have this Nastaliq Farsi script. And you also find that now more and more, art historians are looking to see these paintings as a blend of Indian and Persian styles, which were quite distinctive. They were not exactly like the Safavid paintings in Persia, but they were quite distinctive. And today we are looking at them as sources. So here's a painting, and I think here I want to look at the different nomenclature for historical writing. This painting is Jahangir, and you notice his clothes. It's very much like the women, the tight pants and the sort of loose skirt. And he is having his son weighed. This was called the weighing ceremony, where the ruler was weighed against gold and silver, and then the money was then distributed as donation. And next to it, I have put the different kinds of historical writing. So there's tarikh, which is chronological history annals. There were tarikhs, which were about Tamberlane's life at the time. Tazkire was a form of biography. Somebody wrote their own biography. Name was an exemplary biography. So you would have Akbar Name, Jahangir Name, Humayun Name, that these are great emperors, these are their exemplary biographies. Kanun was about legal context. And Vakiyat was more like a kind of general narrative of events. And I'll just go back in a second. So here's another scene of, I'll come back to those as I move along. Here's another scene of a very formal, you see the decorum and ritual of Jahangir receiving the crown prince, receiving his son, and their other, there's a very famous governor of his called Mukarrab Khan, who's also here on the left, who actually ruled over the Surat and had a lot of power over the Portuguese. This is a very famous painting of Jahangir holding a globe. Now, if you recall, there are portraits of Queen Elizabeth I holding the globe. People in the 16th, 17th century were very conscious of globes. They had discovered by this time that, the world was global and it was like a globe. And so there was a sense of conquest, and his name, Jahangir's name, actually means the world Caesar. Jahan is world and Gir is Caesar, or the owner or the holder of the world. But the Mughals were, although they were Muslim, they never used to go to Mecca. They were not very heavy into that traditional journey. Instead, they worshipped or believed in the Sufi saints. So this is, on the left side is Muinuddin Chishti, who brought Sufi Islam to India. So the Islam in India is a very different, India and South Asia is a Sufi Islam that was started by these Chishtis. And so you have these paintings, this is a scene of Akbar worshipping Chishti. Here you have a similar dynastic scene, and on the left-hand side, people believe this is the Persian poet Saadi. Some people believe it's one of the Chishti Sufi saints. But this is a very interesting dynastic painting. So in the center is Timur, and then you have Babur and Humayun and Jahangir and Akbar. So you have 4 rulers over a long span of time with their ancestor in one painting. So here you can see why they wanted to call themselves the Timurids. Now here we suddenly move to how the English imagined Timur in the play Tamberlane, which obviously he looks nothing like the Muslim Islamic Tamberlane. And I would urge you, if any of you have not read, this is a great play to teach, Tamberlane. And he's a very eclectic figure. He's seen as a despot and he's very brutal, but he's not Islamic. He's a kind of overreacher. He's like Marlowe's other characters. And the very famous scene is where he actually burns the Quran and he calls it superstition, which is here on the right. So I'm just going to show you a few more paintings that are really important. This painting is important for a number of reasons. Once here you can see the European influences. You can see these putti, the cherubs, you can see the hourglass, you can see the cherubs here. What is written is, Allah is great, O Shah, may the span of your reign be 1,000 years. But who are the people in this portrait? This is Chishti giving him a holy book. Below him is the Ottoman emperor. And below him is King James I of England, who is much below the Mughal emperor. And below him is the painting of the artist. I can show you some close-ups. But before I come to that, I want to show you a couple of domestic scenes. We talked of Gulbadan's memoir, Humayun Name. And that memoir, the word they used for that memoir was ehval, which means a distinct history, conditions, states, circumstances. So this is a scene of the birth of Akbar. Akbar was born in, his father was in a battle, so he was born in a camp. And here you have a close-up. You have the birth of Akbar on the side, and you can see the domestic world of the harem. So they did represent women. Women were represented, and you have the baby. And on the left-hand side, you have astrologers at the birth of Akbar. So you have celebrations, you have the birth, and you have music, and then you have astrologers on the right-hand side here. This is the close-up of the big paintings. Here you have, this is a likeness to James I. So you can see that they had contacts. And here you have these very European kind of figures. And then this is the Ottoman Sultan. And this is the artist. And the artists were often Hindus. Some of them were Muslim, but after about Akbar's reign and Jahangir's reign and Shah Jahan's reign, many Hindus were trained. So this is a Hindu artist, an Indian called Bichitra, and he is holding some other painting here in his hand. And this is finally, this is the birth of Jahangir, which is similar. There are lots of paintings with births. You can see the focus on dynastic lineage and other kinds of emphasis on domestic life. So the reason I stress is that there are lots of books written about women in the Mughal world. I'm just giving you a very short glimpse. There was the woman, the Empress of India, Noor Jahan, who was Jahangir's wife, who was very, very powerful, and she sort of governed. There was later on Shah Jahan's daughter, Jahan Ara, who was very famous, had a lot of power, was a businesswoman. So I think that's worth studying and inquiring, is look at paintings of women, study women in Mughal India, and I've given you some names. And one of the things that you see, and I haven't given enough paintings, to the court by Jesuit priests in the early 17th century greatly influenced the court and its art. The Jesuits gave the emperors numerous Bibles which contained engravings and Christian imagery. Jesus was being crowned by angels, the Madonna was depicted traditionally. So they gave them these polyglot, multilingual Bibles. And these were used then later on in Mughal paintings. And this is a very famous one. So this is of Jahangir, this is supposedly Christ. And you can see they're both together. And there's lots written about this. You know, with both of them have halos. Finally, I'm just going to leave you with two things. One is when you are teaching, to kind of teach courses on in-between figures, which is how I design some courses: travelers, explorers, emissaries, ambassadors. That if you look at this period as an age of encounters, then these figures are very important, like Thomas Roe, who stayed in India for 3 years, or Thomas Coriat, who, by the way, knew Persian and wore Indian clothes, or Edward Terry, who was an Anglican Christian but got very interested in Islam, or the Portuguese Jesuits who kept trying to convert the emperors. And I think this is a term I get from Sanjay Subramaniam, from a very good book of his called 3 Ways of Being Alien. It's a short book, it's in the bibliography, and I would urge you to have a look. These are just a few more images here. On the left side, you have images of Jahangir and Shah Jahan and his son, Jahangir and his son, Shah Jahan, and a woman. And on the right-hand side, this is not a very good image. This is the history of Timur as painted by Akbar. So this is called Tarikh-e-Khandan, means the history of the family of Timur. This is just an odd painting that's not about the Mughals. It's an oil painting of the Moroccan ambassador who visited England in London in 1600. And I just put it there because it's actually, it's a painting that is in the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford. It's a very interesting painting to teach in class about Muslim presence and Islamic presence. And this is just a quote about the stranger, again, that Sanjay Subramaniam talks is, who are strangers? Are they, the trader and the merchant are strangers, but who are some of these other go-betweens or passers? And finally, just briefly, it's worth looking at how was the Quran represented in the early modern period. They were fascinated by the Quran. There were lots of Quran translations in Latin. There was a lot of criticism of the Quran as not being, being the work of the devil, and Muhammad being imposter and a liar. But there was also interest. And here on the right-hand side, you actually have an English translation of the Quran, which was in Purkis's book that I began with, Purkis's Pilgrims. And here, this is a very famous translation of the Quran this was translated out of Arabic into French by Sieur Duray, Melazar, who was a resident for the French king at Alexandria. And then this was later translated into English, newly Englished for the satisfaction of all that desire to look into the Turkish vanities. And this was Alexander Ross, who says Muhammad and the Al-Quran are likened to a braying an ass or a blackamoor when set against a beautiful body. So this is a kind of odd, comparison that the Quran is not as beautiful as the Christian text. And what he says is, I know the publishing of the Quran may be to some dangerous and scandalous, dangerous to the reader, scandalous to the higher powers. But then he says, if there were any loveliness, beauty, or excellence in anything else in the Quran that might win the mind and draw the affection after it, I would hold the reading dangerous. But whereas it is such a misshapen and deformed piece, I think the reading of it will confirm us in the truth and cause us to love the scripture so much the more. For as a beautiful body is never more lovely when she is placed near blackamoor. So you find all the racism and xenophobia and everything here. But this shows two things. It shows that they were fascinated by the Quran. There were many translations. They were fascinated by Islam. Islam was the other, but it was a very attractive other in many ways. But they also demonized the other, and you have that sense of it. And here I'm just ending that the Quran is deeply embedded in the political religious thought of Europe and in the intellectual repertoire of medieval and early modern Europeans of different Christian denominations, of European Jews, free thinkers, atheists, and of course, European Muslims. So I think this is a very nice way to end here. And thank you very much. And then we can, later on when I see you in August, we can address some of your questions.
Again, we have Professor Jyotsna Singh here, and the afternoon is devoted to thinking about travel and thinking about connected cultures in the many dimensional ways that she has done through her work and research. And I want to remind you also that Jyotsna Singh is the editor and putting together a new edition of the volume, The Global Renaissance.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This was really nice, and I wish I could have done nothing else for 4 days and attended everything. But I learned a lot, and I also feel that, you know, our work only has value as much as we can disseminate it and generate conversations. So I would, you know, I made the PowerPoint, and I tried to make it really conversational and accessible, and I did the bibliography. Again, I didn't make it very long, but I'm happy to give you other names, other lists. But I would look forward to getting your comments and questions.
We were just talking before people came on. She was generous enough to share her syllabi from some of her courses with us. So those are in the folder with her name. So, okay, we've got more people coming in, and we also have a first question from Teresa.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Terry Trebelcock. I teach in Baltimore County, Maryland, and live in Pennsylvania, and I'm from Michigan, so I feel like we have
I'm a Michigander.
I have two questions. I was so excited to read about the Mughal Empire, partly because the art is so distinctive. I don't know that any other empire or civilization or whatever has something that to me is so immediately recognizable. And my students always ask, how can they have so much representation and faces in Mughal art? So that's my first question. And then I have a second question about the travel narratives, but.
Why don't you go ahead? Maybe I can answer both.
Okay. The travel narratives, I think it would be really interesting for my students to use in class. And I haven't had a chance to go to your links and open them up. But I'm wondering if there's somewhere where they've been kind of chunked for like 10th graders who aren't going to read, you know, a whole book.
Okay. So let me answer the first one. I think Mughal art is something I've only, like the last few years, I've totally obsessed with it. And it wasn't only Mughal, it was sort of the whole Islamic world. And in fact, Karima would probably know more. the Mughals, a lot of their painters were from Persia. When Humayun went to Persia when he was in exile, he brought artists. So there was a lot of cross-pollination between the Ottomans, Safavids, and the Mughals. And there's a great novel, if you haven't read it, it's called My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk.
Mm.
And I would highly recommend that. It's a little long, maybe for graduate students, for high school students, but I think have a look, and you can do that. Second thing, I think what I'm really interested in myself, and I mentioned a little bit in my PowerPoint, is that the Mughal, the emperors, the 5 emperors I talked about, were very interested in European art. So there was a kind of a confluence between European realism, naturalistic art, and the more flattened, stylized sense of the Mughal art. And there are lots of books and theories, but I feel that a lot of the books are very descriptive, and I think people need to look at a little more, for instance, how this world was gendered. It's very interestingly gendered. And I gave some images, and we can talk about them later, is they often depicted domestic scenes of births, of marriages. And I think the Mughals were not Islamic the way the sort of cliches that, oh, you would never have representation, you would never have faces. I think, they were very curious. These 5 Mughals were very curious. They were very engaged with the natural world, with the human world, and all of that. There are other traditions, I think, in the medieval period, probably Susan and Karima know more, is where you had images of Muhammad with his face covered or his face, hidden. I think about travel narratives, and I just give you my sort of autobiography a little bit. So I was a very, traditional classical Renaissance dissertation on history, new historicism. And people would ask me, why are you doing the Renaissance? Like, you're from India, you should do something colonial. And that's what got me interested in travel writing, because I realized that people in the Renaissance didn't sit in England or in Europe, they were traveling. And we were reading about Vasco da Gama in India when I was in school. And I think, and so I did that book with Ivo Camps, he's actually Dutch. He's a lovely person who you should invite sometime. And so we wrote an introduction that you might find useful. It's an introduction to travel knowledge, just a very simple thing. And then I mentioned Rubies, Rubies, Jean Paul, he's Spanish, and writes more of the Iberian world, but he has a good essay where he talks about the travel writing as a republic of letters, that these people read each other's work. And the third person that I briefly mentioned that I would highly recommend is read the writings compiled by Richard Hakluyt. And there's a lot of work being done on Richard Hakluyt. And I'm actually, one of the things I'm working on in my Global Renaissance is looking at the slave trade narratives in Richard Hakluyt. And you can find Hakluyt in lots of modern editions. So I would say, go to the sources. And finally, there's one other person who was the inheritor of Hakluyt, and his name was Samuel Purkis. Some people say Purchas, but it's Purkis. And so after Hakluyt died, he inherited some of his writings. And I've mentioned him in my bibliography because all the Mughal writing, all the British travelers who went to Mughal India, you can find in Purkis. So I think that's, and we can come back to your question more.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Jean Travolsi.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, Dr. Singh. I found your slides simply gorgeous.
Yes, I know. I'm an aesthete.
Simply gorgeous. I can tell by the color on your walls and how you dress. Just gorgeous.
Exactly.
I thought that one slide, I believe it was Akbar weighing his son.
Yeah, it was, I think Jahangir, I can look at it here. I'm sort of looking at it.
To determine his weight in gold.
Right.
So that then he could distribute the money to the poor.
Right.
So arresting and so precious. And I wondered about the family relationships. They seem to be in domestic bliss. They seem to have very good father-son relationships. And I know a little bit about Ottoman history, and they did not have good family relationships in the Ottoman court. There was fratricide, they killed each other. And I wondered if you could speak about that a little bit.
Thank you. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but they were not always the most congenial family relations here either. But I think a few differences, and I'm not an Ottomanist, but you know, I had a graduate student who I directed in Ottoman. I think there were a few differences that I think made a difference in the Mughal. One was that most of the Mughal emperors had wives. They were married, or they were one or two. And then some of them, like Nur Jahan, was very dominant. Akbar's mother, he really worshipped, Maryam Makani. So I think whereas the Ottomans, except for Roxolana, I think they were not queens. They were Khalide, what is it, Walide Sultan. They were mothers of the sultans.
I see.
So I think there was a little difference in then relationships between sons. But again, it varied. Jahangir, who you see here weighing his favorite son, Khurram, who became Shah Jahan, Jahangir had some conflicts with his father, Akbar, for a while, although he was a very beloved son, born after many prayers. And he rebelled and went to Allahabad. So you have streaks of rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the saddest story, which is really sad, is the last, I mean, I'm only dealing with these five, was Aurangzeb. So Shah Jahan had these two sons, and this is a story I don't know if any of you have heard, and one was Aurangzeb, and one was, what's his name? Oh my gosh, there was Shuja, and there was this other one who was the Sufi. And then the Sufi one was very, was not a good warrior. And so he, and they had a battle, and then Shah Jahan was then very puritanical, and Aurangzeb was very puritanical, and basically, kind of destroyed, destroyed the kind of dynasty. The other son, I'm sorry, it was Dara Shikoh. And I don't know if you've heard of him. He was amazing. He translated Sanskrit. He was a syncretist. He had a library in Delhi. The building still stays. The books are lost, but the library is there. And they are beautiful biographies. So he was the favored son. And he was a great scholar, and he was a cosmopolitan. And the other brother defeated him and had him killed. And then there's another which you should know. They had a sister called Jahanara. And she was a great scholar, and she was a follower of the Sufi saints, and she wrote biographies. She is the one who ordered many of the mosques built in Agra. She was a builder. And she sided with the Sufi brother, but then when he was killed, she became a very popular, very famous figure. And so these are, I think there's, but I would like to stress, and I think that's something we can talk about paintings, that at the end of the day, we judge cultures by how they represent themselves, not always what is the truth, but how they want to represent themselves. And the way the Mughals in their paintings represent themselves, I think they do value the gendered aspect of their communities, although they did have harems, more later on. They did value lineage. Lineage was very important. They did value familial relations. They did value affective life, which is what I'm interested in, this sort of emotional, affective life. And you're right, these paintings are very moving.
Yes.
They're very moving. And the ones with the women are very moving. The mother is giving birth. And they're very emotional paintings.
Mm-hmm, they are. I found that I'm romanticizing. By looking at those paintings, I'm romanticized the domestic bliss that took place in that palace.
I think, but I want to be a sort of Sufi. I think it doesn't matter if there's cruelty in the world, which there is. I mean, Jahangir, could be very cruel. But on the other hand, there's the other impulse in people also to show the other side. You know, you can't represent all this domestic bliss if you don't have access to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that you mentioned, Rajiv Kinra, whose work I've cited, I
Yes.
remember him giving a talk, and or maybe he said, you know, the Mughals, I mean, there's lots of cruel stuff in the Mughals, and, you know, we can talk of that. But they also had this amazing cultural production.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they had these millions of paintings. I mean, they had all this cultural production. So they were trying to access some different side. And I think the word he mentions, which I haven't really gone into, he was called Sule Kul. A kul is the community, which is, I think somebody who knows Arabic, it's like, say, universal civility or universal kind of goodwill. And so I think, and I'm sure the Ottomans had a lot of this too. I mean, you know, beneath all the fratricide, because I think the Mughals didn't have clear laws of succession. From, you know, from what I...
Yeah, you can access actually Rajiv Kinra's lecture at our Summer Institute last year on the Enlightenment, and he mentioned that concept of sulh is peacemaking, treaty making, and so it's universal peace in a lot of ways. Yeah,
people called it peace, and he liked to use the word civility. It's kind of interesting, and I've become more interested in looking at, even in my other sort of Renaissance Shakespeare work, is more interested in looking at the affective, so that when we look at the world, we look at it beyond politics in some way. And you know, so when I teach, I mean, I think I've changed my whole thinking a lot. And I tell my students, when I started out in my early 20s, I was a Marxist, and now I'm a Sufi. And I truly mean that, because I think the Marxists can be the same megalomaniacs as anybody else, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I find in the Mughal paintings. There's a kind of, they're reaching out to these different affective states.
Well, that gets me to a question. I don't see hands up right now. So as you gear up your own questions, I see there's a pretty active chat going on. So you can put your questions in there too. But I wanted to ask you then along those lines. Sometimes I've heard art historians say about the Mughal paintings and miniature paintings that these were part of albums, and that they were certainly anything but public art, that only very few people would have actually had access to them. And so when we talk about the figurative drawings, you know, these wouldn't have been, you know, available to the general public or the lower classes or anything like that.
I think that is, I mean, again, I'm not, you know, a full-time artist. I think that you're right. They were part of albums. But I think what is really important is that the Mughals wanted to write history through a visual medium. So these are a part of those albums, like the Akbarname, you know, which are in the British Library. They never let you look at them anymore. They're so, like, you know, you have to apply for permission for months before this. And I haven't seen the Akbarnama, which I'm trying to. So I think it was partly that. Partly, you know, I think that whether you had, you know, poor people or ordinary people looking at them, but they were still a part of the mythology. Like Akbar had the Hamza Name, which are sort of mythological folk tales. So those stories must have circulated in the culture. You know, so whether, and I think this is a question, you know, I think somebody else, who was looking at these paintings or these carpets. So I think even if everybody didn't see them, they were a part of this, you know, and a lot of the artists were also Hindus. A lot of the artist names in the Mughal, Manohar and Bichittar, were Hindu artists. So I think that exactly how much they had, you know, whether they were actually looking at them, I'm sure, like, they had divanayam, they had open meetings, they met people. And so I think that they would be a part of some sense of a popular culture, whether people actually saw these albums or not. At least that's my sense of it.
That takes me to one other thing that is two frequent misconceptions in dealing with the history of the so-called three empires. One of them is the fact that our books, our materials that are often used in pedagogy at high school level are just looking from the palace walls. They're not even looking out of the palace walls. It's all very much about the palace, the dynasties, the rulers, and you get very little sense, if no sense whatsoever, of what was going on in the society. And then the second aspect of that is that many of the textbooks have read backwards this sharp division between Hindu and Muslim in India. And even though they may mention and evoke cultural blending, some of the scholars have mentioned that a Persianate scholar who was Muslim and a Hindu scholar of Sanskrit would have had a shared education, had a shared cultural heritage, really, that reflects in this art. So that's all I'm gonna contribute.
Yeah. No, I think it's really, I'm actually looking at some of the questions, but you're right. I think they're, some of the students are talking of this, that, and even in the pictures, they are the Sufi, they are the Hindu mystics. There are lots of scenes where, you have, I think they were all interested in mysticism and Hinduism. And I think one of the things we have to remember that a lot of the Muslims in India were converts. They didn't bring huge armies with them from Central Asia. There were people who converted. And also Urdu as a language, there's a lot of stuff on languages. And Urdu as a language was a sort of syncretic language, sort of which I speak, which people speak, came from, Hindi and Urdu. And also, I'll answer a couple of these, but I think I wanted to mention somebody pre-Mughal, a name that it would be nice for, is Amir Khusro, who was more 11th, 12th century. He was an amazing poet. And according to many people, he invented the sitar or the tabla. And he syncretized Persian and Hindi and called it Hindavi. So he has lots of religious, that's a whole story, but it was always a syncretic culture. And so I think that's very true. I think there's just one question, I think, about Pamuk's book somebody mentioned, that she watched it on some episode, and I would really urge people to read it. It's a little slow, but it's a very rich book, and you can use parts of it in your reading. So I think that was something that I had looked at.
Okay, someone, I'm going to just cite one of the questions from chat and then call on Karima and Michael Eisenberg. Maureen McCarthy writes, it's interesting to think of the paintings as being like dollhouses. Do they serve a similar purpose, or are they used in similar ways as the Dutch dollhouses we talked about this morning?
Okay, I only heard the pottery. I didn't see the dollhouses. I think that I'm not, you mean like sort of multiple perspectives kind of thing? Is that what you mean by dollhouse?
Maureen?
I'm unmuting, but there's a garbage truck right outside right away.
Okay.
I meant in terms of, I think similar to the question Susan had of how public were they, how were they shared, kind of what was the purpose of them.
Okay. I think, as far as I know, is that they were not hung as such. They were in these albums, they were loose, but they were artist studios. So that must have been a big kind of within the court. I mean, courts at the time were huge. So in the different studios, ateliers of the different artists, there must be people who were helping or painting, or, the paint people, the mixers, and so I think in that sense, certainly these paintings must have circulated in the aristocratic culture. When they were harems, the sort of the stable harem really started in Akbar's time. Before that, it was very peripatetic. The article that I posted about, Gulbadan was very, when they were on move. So I'm sure in the harem, they had access to it. So I remember visiting an amazing place in India called Fatehpur Sikri, where Akbar had his court for, I don't know, some years, 10, 15. He took a long time building it, and then he lived, and for various reasons, he went back to Agra. And that's where you get the sense of this huge complex. So there were hundreds and hundreds of people in what was called the court. There was the harem, And then the Portuguese lived there. You know, they lived like 10 years in Akbar's court. So they had their own chapel. And so they were all, and then Ruby Lal's book, which is on domesticity, she says that there was a lot of traffic, for instance, in the harem. There were all kinds of people coming. And many of them may have been men, you know, jewelers or doctors or younger sons or, so I think they would not be maybe available out in, you know, among poor people in rural areas, but I could imagine that the people who came to the court, the numbers in the court, which is a huge, I think these would be available. And to me is again, the question that I ask is that they represent these worlds with some sort of consistency. You know, there are a lot of women, I'm interested in the paintings in which women figure. Often they're relational, they're familial. There's one painting I don't have of Babur meeting his sisters after some conflicts, of Nur Jahan, of Jahan Ara. Some are painted, some are not. Later on, I think in the late 17th century, there are also of some Mughal women drinking wine. You know, so obviously, you know, there's pictures of Jahangir in his harem playing Holi, which is that color festival in India. Yeah. And very sensual. So the question I always ask is, you know, and there's one of women swimming at night. That's an amazing, it's in the Chester Beatty Library. I've seen the original. And they're swimming in this, and some people are peeping in or something.
I'm sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
would that be Khosrow and Shireen? The story of Khosrow and Shireen?
This is not this is not a myth. This is just, it's a little later. I think it's kind of late Shah Jahan. It's just women. They don't name any. No, it's not one of those stories.
Okay.
So you had your hand up, Karima, too.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that struck me was Akbar and his Din Ilahi, or you know, his what do you call it, the religion of man. He was so open to other religions. And the house, what do you call the house of worship, was a place where he brought in people to discuss and debate about religion. Right. And one of the things that's really interesting is then you look at the comments Edward Terry made of, you know, Islam is a monster of many heads. And then I wanted to also mention in the 12th century, the first translation of the Quran by Robert of Ketton, when he went down to Spain, the title of his so-called Quran was Muhammad the Pseudo-Prophet.
Right. Yeah.
It shows you the attitude of the Europeans towards Islam, and then how different it was with Akbar saying, you know, let's bring together this conversation and let's have a religion of man, which obviously frustrated the Portuguese. You talk about how they tried to convert him, and he was like, yeah, I don't want to hear it.
I think that's a really, and that's another place, you know, so when you go to Fatehpur Sikri, that was called the Ibadat Khana. You ask them, and there was some dispute exactly which room it was. But I remember when we went, not a few years ago, and they sort of said, so I think that was very important. But let me just go back to the Portuguese. I've recently, the last year or so, and I've cited here João Vicente Melo. He was a student of Rubius. He does very smart work, and I have a chapter of his here. And so the more I talk, you know, so the Jesuits have a kind of orthodoxy of, yes, we want to make everybody Catholic, and they keep hoping. But I think even the Jesuits, they had a very kind of, I think, a kind of larger vision than we give them credit for. They knew languages. They stayed in the court. They interacted. They talked to people. And I think all these five Mughals, they were curious about the world, and they were curious about other religions. The other important thing, which I only learn these things when you actually go to these places, the Mughals never went to Mecca. None of them went for the Hajj, which is really interesting. And they were followers of the Chishtis, the Muinuddin Chishti, and these are beautiful shrines. You know, that's how I love architecture, and I've been to these places. So, and a lot of the painting that I can do a little screen share here, and let me just get that out, and I think we can look at that painting, which is so, and I think somebody has referred to it in the questions that they saw this painting. If I can I get no, I can't get a screen share because
yeah, you should be able to.
Okay.
Yeah, just go to the green box at the bottom.
Yeah, I went there and
There's no green box with
I
an arrow.
clicked it, but my desktop is showing like, no. I mean that I clicked, but my desktop is, 1 minute. Let me just.
Yeah, it's sometimes a question of bringing up the thing you intend to.
Yeah. Let me just get
In the
back.
meantime, while you're doing that, the Chistis, is it their descendants who are so active in California right now?
I don't know what are
I
they.
think there's a whole lot of Sufis in California that are Chistis.
I don't know of that, but they may be. I mean, they, you know, all the Chistis were, they came from Chisht, which is in near Persia, and they were from that Baghdad school. And so Muinuddin set it up, and then the first few there, so there was Muinuddin Chishti, then there was Fariduddin, whose mausoleum is in Lahore, and then there was Nizamuddin, in which great mausoleum in Delhi, and Amir Khusro used to live there, and then there was Bakhtiyar Kaki, Kutubuddin. I think 4 or 5 were really important. For instance, Jahan Ara is buried in Delhi in Nizamuddin's complex, in the Chishti complex, buried there.
Okay. Yeah.
And she wrote a biography of the Muinuddin Chishti. And the Mughals followed them, and they didn't follow, you know, they didn't go to Mecca. Partly people say they didn't go to Mecca because they were so afraid somebody would take away their throne, so they didn't.
Mm-hmm. Got a point there.
But Gulbadan, you know,
That happened.
who was Akbar's aunt, she went to Mecca with a group of women. And that's a really interesting story. And the Portuguese lent them some boats, and they went to Mecca. So the women or the people who were sent to Mecca were the people that, okay, I won't behead you, but you just go to Mecca. You know, the people who were in disfavor with the emperor.
Well, and taking into account that the Portuguese sank pilgrim ships, it's a good thing they lent their ships.
Exactly. So I think that was the issue. I don't know why I can't access the.
Michael Eisenberg had his hand up too. Did you get your question in, Karima, all the way?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Michael?
Is he there?
He sometimes has internet connections. Michael, are you there and unmuted?
Yeah, here, I'm sorry.
Okay, great.
Go ahead, yeah.
I just have a little small comment. It's not very meaningful, but thank you for your incredible presentation. So insightful, and also that was interesting. Your last comment about you know, the Jesuit project. I think it's very that's very generous, and I think how we should see the truth is a lot of our understanding, you know, in early modern times certainly is through this acquisition of knowledge, you know. So I think that was very interesting what you said. I just had a silly
Hoyas, go Hoyas. We're Georgetown.
Oh, that's right.
My silly comment was just that you said you can't access those sources at British Library, and I know they're always on lockdown.
Yeah.
But my experience was, and this was a number of years ago, but for what it's worth, I was able to see some Quran and some Akhbarnama and Book of Kings at the Bibliothèque Nationale, at the BNF. Yeah. And they have a very strict policy, probably stricter than British Library, in their European manuscripts, but their you know, Middle Eastern, Far Eastern, Asian division, they're just very magnanimous, and they were like willing, without any kind of calling card or anything, just to pull these things out. It might be worth a visit. Because they really appreciated the solicitation of their manuscripts. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that brings us to sort of the larger. Thanks very much for letting me know. And maybe I think the British Library actually is so invested in India. You know, their South Asia used to be called the India Office Library. I mean, the Indian collections. I mean, they have everything on India over there. And so they're very protective of, you know, showing, I mean, actually, because, and a lot of things are digitized, so they just want you to go online. But I sort of want to come back to what you said is about sort of the archives. So it's interesting why the French are easier to showing us Asian stuff, but they're more protective of European collections. You know, it's all a question about value and archive. So I think that would also show students. I think somebody had a very interesting question, if you don't mind, about the Muslim, the parda. They said that the status of women really changes at some point. The practice of parda shields women from mixed company. But some of these paintings are also so intimate, exactly. And I think that is what strikes you, that if they were so hidden, because the Europeans never saw these women very much. So a lot of the mythology about the harem came from European sources. I think within the Islamic world, they had friends, they had visitors, and they were definitely, they were familial and social arrangements. And I hope if you didn't get a chance, I would hope you would read that article that I posted, which I wrote on the boundary crossings of this princess, because you see how the emperors seek out the women. They seek out the sisters and the wives and the mothers, and the emperor often visits the harem or visits them. They had, so it wasn't this kind of world that we imagine. And I think that, to me, when I teach undergraduates, I mean, they're not unlike high school students when you teach freshmen or sophomores or something. I think you have to really help them break away from stereotypes about Islam, which are, I don't know how deep and entrenched they are. And I don't know if others, but I always feel that they're seeing Islam through just all kinds of, lenses.
Well, this is a great transition to asking you to speak about teaching with travel narratives, which will be the theme for the rest of the afternoon. And we'll have you working on some actually shortly. And I wanted to mention, in connection with the knowledge about the harem, of course, the famous travel narratives of Lady Montagu.
Right, which is a sort of more 18th century. I've actually used those and taught those. I think travel narratives, what I would do is I would look at the sort of European travel narratives and begin with people like Hakluyt and Ramusio. And I like the idea of Republic of Letters, that this was shared knowledge, and these people were invested in certain kinds of, imperial or trade or exploration, and writing was as important as the travel. And in fact, East India Company was asked to keep a record. I'm also, although I don't know Portuguese, alas, I think I'm very interested in the Lusiads and the Portuguese project, because they were the first travelers. And I only last year absolutely loved, I went to Lisbon and I just fall in love with the city. It's amazing. So I think I usually start with travel narratives is just immerse them into this world, give them sections of the 5 travelers that I mentioned, and talk about the whole notion, which I did in my first monograph, is the whole notion of discovery. What Europeans thought they discovered. Columbus discovered America. And so I think I just, depending with whether it's undergraduate or graduate, and the course syllabi that I have is, I called it Early Modern Islam and the West. And I put the word Islam first deliberately for my class. And in that, we simply looked at the Islamic empires. Again, I focus more on the Mughals because that's sort of my field. But we read a lot of what are the Turk plays. So we read literature with the travel. There are a lot of travel plays. The Tempest, of course, I've written on, that's a play. But there are a lot of Turk plays. We read Tamburlaine, who was the ancestor of the Mughals. Timur is Tamburlaine. So I usually mix literature and a few travels. So Tamburlaine is a very good text. Begin with Tamburlaine, which has, he's actually a Quran burner. He's like an overreacher. He's very European in some ways. And yet he is the ancestor of the Mughals. Or begin with Titus Andronicus, or some of what are called the Turk plays, the Malcontent by Marston. So there are various literary works of the period. And then you can look at travelers to the Ottoman Empire. There are lots of very, George Sand, and of course, Mary went to the Ottoman Empire. The other thing that I, of course, love is I talk about gender and travel a lot. And that's, those of you who teach gender, and I'm happy to, because I think some of you have talked of parda, and you've talked of women, you've talked of elite women. And travel was quite gendered, and the encounters they had, you know, there, although women didn't travel, but there were some women, or how they described women, or how they described notions of masculinity. You know, so I think those are the two things I do. Is one is mixed literature and travel writing, and two is look at specific. It could be gender. It could be just knowledge. You know, some of the stuff you were showing in the Holbein painting is, you know, what are travelers learning as they go along. And one thing just to end is that in all of early modern travel writing, there's a trope that is there always, and it's called eyewitness. They always claim to be eyewitnesses, and they really, it's not quite, it's very mediated. It's very, and so even Edward Terry, on one hand, he's attacking Islam and Muhammad, but then he's praising Muslims and comparing them to Christians, and as is Perkis, as are the Jesuits in many ways. I should switch off my, and I think I just wanted to come back to the Jesuits. You know, I had all my high school education with Irish nuns.
Wow.
So and my brother studied with Jesuits. So I love, you know, I learned English grammar. I learned everything from Irish nuns, and Irish nuns made us read everything. So I think if you meet, I don't know, if you meet any students coming from India, you know, we are on our levels of expertise may be very different, but we have read the canon. You know, so when I came here, like, you know, 18, 19, 20, you know, we have read all the canon because the nuns. And I've lived more of my life in America, is I think I'm surprised how little students have read when I ask them, have you read this? Have you read this? So and I think the Jesuits were much more complex, man. The Jesuit project was much more complex and cosmopolitan, and, you know, the Portuguese were colonizers, but I think it was a very interesting project too. And they left a lot of legacy because they knew languages, they translated texts, they engaged, and the English hated the Jesuits because they were closer to the Mughals. Yeah, the English were never welcome in the court. Partly, I think it was the languages. The Jesuits knew the languages.
Well, your last comment reminds me of something I ran across in my dissertation work on mass education in India, Egypt, and Britain. And there were people later in the 19th century who said the grammar schools in Britain were so stuck in the classics, the reading classics, but in India, the schools being conducted in English language were reading Shakespeare, were reading modern, early modern and modern British literature before the British elite were.
Exactly, yes, yes. So, you know, and actually the first piece I ever published as a graduate student was called Shakespeare in India. I did some research to find out, you know, how it went. It was a part of the curriculum. And I think somebody left a nice thing about Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And I think a lot of museums in America have great collections of Islamic art. And I would actually just, you know, I'm by religion a Sikh, I'm not a Muslim. But I think the North Indian culture, at least the culture in my family, I think it's a very syncretic and it's a very Muslim culture. You know, we have horrible government in India who won't acknowledge that now, but it's a very Muslim culture. So my father knew classical Persian, you know, and I think Muslims themselves also often don't realize the richness, the languages, the poetry, the art, the music, the affect, the sulekul, and how the Hindus, you know, that's what Rajiv Kindra writes about, the Hindus and the Muslim. And I think, to me, that's why this is a passion of mine, to talk about the Mughals. It's personally, it's very, very important to me. It's really, you know, I'm a Shakespearean. I mean, I'm an interloper. I'm not a real anything, a real historian. I'm a real literature person. But I really self-taught myself and written and published, and because I really think we need to get a window. But they were not perfect. They killed their brothers and they did the fratricide and, you know, all of that. But I think the cultural products they left us um, is really, really important.
Well, you know, it's no accident that we have a number of literature scholars in this Renaissance Institute this year, and they've really just been so much enriched the conversation in this way. I do want to mention, perhaps just quickly, there is a foundation in the United States for Muslim, for a sort of a think tank kind of thing, in a bit of a Sufi sort of way, called the Nawawi Foundation in Chicago. And one of their stellar writers, Nawawi Foundation, one of their stellar writers, kind of a rock star, is Omar Farouk Abdallah. And he writes a very heartfelt, urgent essay to the Muslims who have been brainwashed, if you will, by the sort of puritanical, fundamentalist, even technocratic view of Islam that's kind of, my own daughter, she's in her late 20s, calls checklist Islam, you know, the stripped down Islam for the technocrat age. And he makes this very, very passionate argument for recognizing culture. And he has one of the most beautiful metaphors I've ever heard about the spread of religion. And he says that that we have to respect, and Islam from the beginning respected other cultures, and so that Islam spread into different geographic, ethnic, language regions, as water flows into different types of riverbeds.
Sure.
You know, the rocky river, the pebbles coming down from the mountain, the floodplain, you know, where it spreads out. And actually Goethe has a poem about Muhammad that uses the similar metaphor. But what he's saying is that Islam flowed into these different spaces like a river, like the water of a river, but it was shaped by the riverbed, and in turn it shaped the riverbed. So it's a very dynamic process. And I think you could apply that to the spread of religions in general, as we discussed.
Right. I think I always link it coming back to travel. So I think that's another nice, like I've done papers on the sort of Anglo-Muslim, which I did for the Newbery. So they were, you know, these, I call them Protestant global crossings. So Terry was a Protestant, Perkis was a Protestant. And yet when they went to these countries, they were very interested in Islam. And the Mughals were very interested in Christianity. You know, so I think the world is always more syncretic and mixed than people believe. You know, that's something we learned from Shakespeare. It was all mixtures. You know.
And many of those travelers felt liberated from their own home cultures in exploring other cultures as well. That's a theme in travel.
Who I haven't mentioned, but whose work I use is Leo Africanus.
Yes.
Yeah.
I teach that Natalie Davis's biography all the time in all my Renaissance courses. I mean, that was another whole topic I didn't mention. But
actually, that's the travel accounts that I selected for this afternoon to work with from the literature sample Beyond 1,001 Nights. I want to thank you so much, Professor Singh. You've been with us all day. Of course, or all week, and you're perfectly welcome to come on for the wonderful cooking demonstration. You'll love it tomorrow afternoon by Annie Gall.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I wanted to talk about the fact that one of the things I do is have my students write their own travel narrative at the end of a semester. And if you look, can I quickly share the document? I've got the Islam project
open to share.
Do you?
Yes,
okay.
I have it open to share right now. And I was going to do it when we come back from our break.
Oh, okay.
Certainly do it now.
Because this is a great final, I use this in place of a final exam, actually. So if you would scroll down a little bit, Susan.
Yeah, it's been posted, by the way, in the Google folder of uploadable files.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah. And what I do is I have the students make up their own. Here's a good one right here. Why don't you stop right there for a little bit? They have to make up a character, like a Muslim Chinese silk merchant traveling by boat to the Red Sea and to Cairo, a Buddhist scholar from what they would have called Siam, which we now call Thailand, who sees many Muslim traders are settling in the city of Bangkok. Wants to travel through Cairo and learn more about them, Turkish bookbinder, a rabbi from Cordoba. So they make up their own characters, and then scroll down a little bit if you would, Susan, because, yeah, good, right there. They have to have the character, the gender, the date of birth, and then a brag sheet, which was quite normal. you know, if I'm the most wonderful scholar in all of, you know, whatever, Cairo. And that was normal. Yeah. And then I have them look at some questions like, are you really sure you want to go through Baghdad in the mid 13th century? Because you've got the Mongols coming through.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So they really do a great job with this. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention is they write their own rihla or their own travel diary, and there are certain elements they have to put in there. And I make them create their own book so that they also learn how to create a book.
Yeah, that's you mean like a hardcover book?
Yeah, yeah, they love it.
Yeah.
Pardon me?
To stitch it and everything?
Yeah, they stitch it. Yeah.
I actually once took a course on Coptic stitch bookmaking, which was wonderful.
Oh, wow.
I have a book I made. Actually, I can show it to you among the things I learned.
Okay, so it is time for our 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we will have enough time to really dig into a lesson, a skill lesson on travel, and an actual excerpt from Leo Africanus, not from the novel based on his life, but from his actual life. It is in, and you can bring this up when you come back, from the 1001 Nights collection that is also, along with the emergence of Renaissance, one of the things we're able to share with you. And I will put up the pages that it starts, the travel account starts on page 178, which is 184 if you're looking at it in Adobe. But the actual page numbers on the pages, the facsimile pages, are page 178. So, and Leo Africanus was the sole source of knowledge about internal West Africa for almost till the 19th century.
Is this here on your Google Drive? This
it is in the box folder. It is, along with the emergence of Renaissance, it's a collection called Beyond 1001 Nights of literature sampler from Muslim civilization.
Yeah, okay. So you do have a description of Africa? Is that what you have?
Yes, it's direct, his account that was translated, that for the Pope, was written for the Pope.
Which is also then you find in the Purkis's travel writing.
Yes, yes. And voluminous writing, I mean, amazing.
So he was given to Pope Leo X as a gift.
Right. Yeah, and then
he was kidnapped and given as a gift.
Right.
And he had various names. Yeah, let me get to that. Yeah.
Okay, so
if I can ask you, when is the cooking?
So thank you. I'm sorry.
Sorry, when is the cooking demonstration?
It's on Friday afternoon, tomorrow afternoon. And you would love the readings that she put together. One of them is on kushari, which she attributes to travel with India and exchange with Gujarat, which I actually came upon that with a colleague of mine who I happened to be talking to somebody in my house when we were on the phone about making kushari, and my husband's Egyptian. And he says, what? Kushari? That's a thing that means mixing it up in Gujarati. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I just want to make sure we all take our 5-minute break and then come back in time to dig into some of the travel account literature and skills that we have here. So, so 5 minutes and then come back, flash yourself on when you come back, and try to bring up the 1001 Nights. And I'll show you a couple of other things as well. And all of that is in the day 4 material, not the literature sampler, but all the other materials that we'll be looking for.
Did you say page 178?
178 if you're reading the pages on the facsimile, but if you're looking through Adobe, it's 184 to 187.
Okay.
If you've got it open in Reader, Acrobat Reader, I mean.
Oh, here we go. Description of Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah, his title was actually, oh, here it is. I was going to say it was quite a bit longer because it was, you know, a description of Africa and things therein or something. It was
right. Exactly.
Had a great title.
So when we go to the Google folder for that.
It's for which?
For the Leo Africanus.
Yes, it's in the box folder. It's a great document called Beyond 1001 Nights.
Okay.
Literature sampler, and it's in the same folder. Yeah, you'll see it out there.
Yeah.
It's too big for the Google folder. It's one of the things we put up before.
Oh, so this is something that you've put. This is very interesting. I should just buy this.
It is free.
Oh,
You
really?
can, it's all yours. It's just been made digitally available without a paywall.
Like, is it in a book form too?
It was in in the form of a ring binder. It looks like this. Of course, I'm going to get rid of my
Yeah, I can.
screen. Yeah, it's
Office opens
like that. So it's a ring bound thing because teachers reproduce these things, so it has to be able to lie flat. But it's now available in digital form for the first time without a paywall.
You know, another thing I've taught is Muqaddamah. I've taught Ibn Khaldun.
It's in there. A piece of it is in there too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's like 12 different genres of literature.
Susan, I have a general question about this and also about Dar al-Islam. You have these incredible resources, and I've only downloaded a tiny fraction. How long will they be available online? I just want to make sure I go and download everything I need.
The knowledge base is permanently there, but I suggest that you bring it into your own digital world, because you never know what can happen on any given day when things go down and stuff. One of the things I'm panicking about is that at the end of this year, Adobe Flash is going to disappear, and a whole lot of websites from museums use Flash to let you zoom in on paintings. So I don't know what they're going to do.
It's really a mess.
The Indian Ocean and World History that was sponsored by the Oman Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center was also, the whole thing was programmed in Flash, and they spent a lot of time, effort, and money to actually get it programmed in HTML so that it would work for the duration.
You know, somebody looked up the Renaissance, the UN, I read The Emergence of Renaissance. It's over $100 on on Amazon, because you can't find it anymore.
But that's one of Amazon's fake postings, because there's no one to send it. They often put stuff up at ridiculous prices that doesn't actually exist, and they write you later on and say, gee, sorry, we couldn't fulfill this order. Same thing with the lit sampler.
Wow. Susan, could you give us the other page numbers, please, beside 178?
The page numbers, if you're in Acrobat Reader, are 184 to 187.
Thank you.
I'm going to get some water and come back.
I don't know if Karima Ilavi is still there.
Yeah, I am. I am.
This is Michael Eisenberg. You were kind of.
Hello again.
What?
I said hello again.
Hello again. You were so kind to respond to my questions by email in Dar al-Islam, and I just love your presentations. But I was in a sidebar to Susan earlier this week. I was just raving about how you rocked my world with Thomas Aquinas and everything. It's unbelievable. I'm a medievalist, and you know, I've studied at some real premier institutions. And of course, you talk about Aristotle through Arabic sources. You know, and we know that he's looking at Avicenna, but I never knew about him being, you know, connected in some way to the court in Sicily and at the University of Naples. I mean, it's just really, and I can't even. I look at the major medieval sources, because I look back, I was like, have I missed this? Nobody ever said it to me at Columbia, at Princeton, at CUNY. I never heard that. And it just, you know, if he had any kind of knowledge of Arabic or something, or just his direct connection to that, it just makes so much more sense, you know? So if you have any more bibliography on that, I couldn't find very much. I found about his dad some, but not specifically about him. You know, I have seen references to his being at University of Naples, and I didn't know that that was commissioned by Frederick II, as you indicated, you know, based on a little bit more broad of a international design and infusing it with kind of Arabic structures of learning. So that was very meaningful. But anything you have, any bibliography you can throw me would be just great. I just feel like you totally changed my world. You know, that was one of many things that I got. It was just brilliant. Thank you.
Great.
And
thank you.
But I really appreciate that. Then that should be like you know, posted in the New York Times or something. I mean, that's like, it's earth-shattering in the way it restructures, you know, constructions of pre-modern and Renaissance and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's like when I said that I've been teaching humanities and world history, and there's certain major events in Europe that I never even studied in graduate school. I had no idea, like the sacking of Rome.
Yeah, that never heard of that at all.
Yeah, I was just like, what? And in polite company, we don't put that in books. And I was reading it and going, my God. I mean, it was brutal. Some of the mercenaries for fun were taking orphans and throwing them into the river and watching them drown because they thought that was a really great way to entertain yourself. So some of the brutality that comes up there that was just amazing. And I really like researching the Medici popes because, as I said, Hassan al-Wazan, or Leo Africanus, was actually given to Pope Leo X as a gift. And Leo X was very much into scholarship. Very interested in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then you find this guy that's been kidnapped by Botaviglia, the Spanish pirate. And in fact, the other thing is kind of fun is the fact that one of the popes was a pirate before he became a pope. I can't remember his name now. I had it. Baldassare Cosa was a pirate, and then he became a pope. So, somebody was speaking yesterday in our small group about wouldn't they have attracted pirates, like if you're going across the ocean with silver. And it's like, well, yeah, so Cosa, he became Pope John the 23rd. And there was a time when there were actually 3 men claiming to be Pope, but Baltasar Cosa was put into the papacy through bribery by the Medici family with the agreement that once he became Pope, the Medici would become the bankers to the Vatican. So that's how they became the Vatican bankers. And actually, something that's really, really interesting for upper school students is a video on YouTube called Medici. I can't remember the name of it. Something, I can't remember.
Godfathers of the Renaissance.
Thank you. Godfathers of the Renaissance. Thank you, Lucia. Yeah, that is a tremendous movie. It really is. And it talks about how they got Cosa into the papacy with the agreement that they will then have a monopoly on being bankers to the Vatican. So lots of stuff that I certainly never studied as a history student.
Okay, thank you. I think we're all back now. If you want to flash yourselves back on. I want to share a couple of resources before we dive into the travel accounts, and I wish someone would hit me over the head if I exceed 3 minutes. If you could, but I'm far away, so you can't. But anyway, okay. I dropped in on one of the groups and before lunch, and wanted to share with them a wonderful resource called the Museum with No Frontiers, which has a number of exhibits. I have posted in the Google folder, that we're using to share things. This is a marvelous thing. One of the parts of it is Discover Islamic Art. Another one is Discover Baroque Art. And then this one, then they have a number of galleries on all sorts of artistic topics. The idea here, this is funded by the European Union, to join the museums of the Euromed region. In other words, the European, even Arab museums in the Persian Gulf, which is not exactly Mediterranean, but anyway, a very rich collection with exhibits. And here's the one on Discover Islamic Art that has a whole lot of exhibits that you can just go through and have students be able to view them. I hope you're not seeing my screen now. Okay, Umayyads, Abbasids, and then there's thematic ones. And the other exhibits, again, I put together all the links. One of them that's really fascinating is called Sharing History, about the Arab world in Europe in the 19th century. And this is very difficult, 18th and 19th century, sorry, the long 19th century, to the end of World War I. And so it's just got an amazing set of collections of things on economy, trade, city and urban spaces. And these are all objects from museums that are captioned and collected together into exhibits. I just wanted to tell you that. And then the other thing that came up as I was visiting that group was an exercise that I've done with students in museums, and we also use this for the Caravans of Gold webinar, is a way to get students engaged with art objects. We can do this, of course, with these virtual exhibits or with actual exhibits. If this object could talk, what would it say? Visual analysis, in which students choose objects, one or two or however many you have time for, from the exhibit, read the museum tag, become experts on them, but then their expression of their object, of their study of the object, is to make the object speak. They're interviewing the object using these questions, and they answer the question and emote as if they are the object. And I've seen students just ham it up, and it really gets them past that barrier of I'm looking at art, gets them to look into how it was made, you know, relevant to the Making and Knowing project, to think what it's made of, where would those things have come from, and so on. And also even gets into what am I worth to the maker, merchant, buyer, or thief who possessed or sold me that made me land in this exhibit. So, so that's another thing I've also uploaded in there. Now on to our topic, which is reading travel accounts. There are numerous ones in the literature sampler, but I wanted, because of the period, to focus on Hassan al-Wazan or Leo Africanus. This is a skill lesson actually taken from the answer key, or the map key of the Indian Ocean and world history. It's a simplified version of Jerry Bentley's travel narratives from World History Sources at the Center for History and New Media at George Mason. It's simply a series of questions to ask about a travel account that help you to hone in on who the traveler is, very much like the questions that are in the lesson that Karima just brought out. I've also posted that as one of the readings for today, in fact, and here's the link to the one at the Center for History and New Media in World History Sources. So without further ado, you would have the opportunity to bring up, I hope, the literature sampler from the box folder. You can go back and make sure we know exactly where it is. I know some of you have already been bringing it up. So there's the skills lesson, and there's Jyotsna Singh's materials. And coming out here from day 5 readings, here's the literature sample on emergence of Renaissance. It's one full document. It's not like the emergence of Renaissance divided up. It's in fact all here. And you can just open that up and go into it. It's also linked in the readings for today. Actually, it's not linked in the readings for today. But anyway, you know how to get it now. And you just go to page 178, 179. There's a background piece on Hassan al-Wazan that talks about who he is and his amazing story. So I'm going to make breakout groups again, and hope that you will have a chance to engage with this travel account. It wouldn't be a crime if you flipped a little bit up to look at some of the other travel accounts in the collection. And so here we go. I'm going to stop sharing now and assemble us into groups.